All right, it is 12:01 on my watch, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to Medical Grand Rounds, the University of Colorado. I want to offer a special welcome. Today is the first week of Medical Grand Rounds for the new academic year. And I couldn't be more excited to have our speaker today, Dr. Harlan Krumholz, be the person who kicks off Grand Rounds for us this year. A couple of quick announcements. The first is that due to the resurgence of COVID-19 and the Delta variant, it seems to be the better part of valor to keep Medical Grand Rounds virtual for at least the first half of the year. So we will keep these talks virtual through January 1st. I'll make a decision after that as to whether we think we can do these safely in public. I am as disappointed as you are, and I apologize that these have to continue virtual. Second announcement is that I'm pleased that we are able to once again offer CME and mock credit for Grand Rounds this year. Please use the link that will come to you in the chat section to get your mock credit. And the third is a reminder to please use the Q&A feature to ask Dr. Krumholz all of your questions. The chief medical residents and myself will be gathering those questions as the talk goes on, and we'll use the time at the end of his talk to ask some of those most pressing questions. And now for today's speaker, I'm very pleased to announce and to introduce Dr. Harlan Krumholz. He is the Harold Hines Professor of Medicine and Epidemiology at the Yale University School of Medicine. He's a member of the Division of Cardiology there. As he and I have agreed, his CV is too long to read, but I'll mention that he was a Yale undergrad where he completed his studies magna cum laude. He did his residency training at UCSF where he was a chief resident at Moffitt. His cardiology training was done at Beth Israel in Boston, and then he returned to his undergrad alma mater where he has been for the past 20 plus years. He is the founder and director of the Center for Outcomes Research at Yale New Haven Hospital. He's also the co-director for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholars Program, the Yale Center for Research, Computing, and a number of other enterprises. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, has served on over 100 review committees in his career, and has authored, it says exactly 1,014 publications, although I read one last week that I did not see on his CV, so I know it's at least 1,015. Across a number of different fields, primarily in cardiology, but his interests also include ethics, geriatrics, aging, diversity, clinical decision-making, access to care, and education. And I'm very pleased that he's going to speak on a slightly different topic today, which is titled medRxiv, What is it? Why should I care? Relating to quality of information, how it's disseminated, and how we access it as doctors. And so it really is my privilege to mention, to introduce Dr. Harlan Krumholz.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. And what a pleasure for me to be at the University of Colorado Grand Rounds. I almost feel like University of Colorado is a second home, even though I haven't been there very much, because the large number of people that I know there, the great admiration I have for so many people. I have David Schwartz on the phone, so I can tell David, you've got the most amazing group of outcomes researchers in almost the world. And such a great accumulation of young talent. It's just extraordinary. And senior as well. I mean, and for lots of these are, the ones that I know the best are located within cardiology. Peter Buttrick has just done a remarkable job pulling these people together. Larry Allen, Stacey Darby, David Beckelman, Kelsey Flint, Paul Hess, Mike Ho, Pratiti Kanzazi, Chris Konopke, Demetria McNeil, David McGidd, Fred Masudi, great friend of mine. I know Fred's taken on another position, still remains very connected to the University of Colorado. Dan Matlock, Sarah Perman, Pam Peterson, John Rumsfeld, who also now has taken on a variety of positions, but still remains very connected to the University of Colorado. And then folks like Paul Verosi, also connected with outcomes research, Greg Schwartz, my old chief resident, David Cow, who's breaking new ground in medical informatics, Mike Bristow, who I admired when he was chief of cardiology and throughout his innovation and entrepreneurship, as well as his close adherence to science. My good friends, John Messenger, John Carroll, Colleen McElwain, who I had the pleasure of writing with, Ed Havernack, who I worked with way back in the pro days, Stu Linus, who we worked on ABIM together, and many more. And just, these are folks that I've either been watching or I've been admiring, have had the privilege of working with. It's just such a rich environment at the University of Colorado. So it just is a great pleasure for me to be here today. What I wanted to focus on in the talk today is sort of it's a meta talk in a way. It's a talk about the research ecosystem. And it's also a talk about change and how we bring about change in medicine. And I sort of call this medRxiv, what is it? Why should I care? And also, how do I pronounce it? Because I notice that people aren't even aware of what this is in many still corners of academia. And so I want to take this opportunity to talk to you about it and to bring you up to date on it, to brief you on it. But a subtext of the talk is about making change in medicine. And so while I want to talk to you about medRxiv, I also want to give you some inspiration, maybe a spark of thinking about how this kind of change may apply to what you're doing. So in terms of disclosures, I have no relevant financial disclosures for this talk. I'm a co-founder of medRxiv and a volunteer for medRxiv. I'm a member of the medRxiv oversight team. My institution receives no revenue from medRxiv, and of note, medRxiv is at this point receiving some support from Chan Zuckerberg initiative. So I want to start this out with this idea of stone soup. I doubt that many Grand Rounds have brought you back to Marsha Brown's book and this old parable, this old tale that's been told many times in many different ways. And I don't know if many of you heard this story when you were a kid. I certainly did. And it was a story of soldiers who show up in a town, and the town at first is uncertain about them, and they're hungry, and they're going around looking for food, and there's not much food in the town in any case. And so they're sitting there reflecting on their fate, and they are down by the river, and they say, well, we'll start with stone soup. And what they do is they take a big pan, a big pot, and they put in a rock, and they put in the water, and they start boiling it. And people pass by, and they're kind of curious about it. And they say, well, what's that? And they say, stone soup. And they say, well, that's crazy. I mean, you can't, there's nothing in stone soup. But next thing you know, somebody says, but I got a couple carrots. And then the next person walks by and has a little barley. And then the next person has some beans. And next thing you know, people in the town have walked by, and people seeing this have contributed something. And in the end, there's a marvelous stew that's produced, of which everyone partakes. And the reason I say this is that I'm going to talk to you about the bias towards action and the notion of starting, even if you don't know where you're going to end, when you see a problem that needs to be solved. So another thing, another angle on this I want to talk about as we think about changes is why is it so hard to think about new ways of doing things? But most times we can't even see a new way. We're embroiled within a system, and we believe that we're locked into thinking that we're stuck with the constraints of this system. So what we do is we try to figure out how to go faster or better, but always within the constraints that we're facing, rather than contemplating what might be able to be entirely different about this. How do we change the frame? By the way, this works very well in solving scientific problems too, which is if you keep trying to solve it along the line that everyone has always tried to solve it, you're unlikely to come up with a eureka moment that all of a sudden provides an insight that enables something new to be accomplished. There was a quote from a Kenyan commencement speech that was given by David Foster Wallace. So he says, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, morning, boys, how's the water? And the two fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks at the other and goes, what in the hell is water? So I want to just explore this for a minute. So what's this, does this mean? Why is he saying this? And the point is that one person is appreciating, the fish, the older fish is appreciating that they're actually immersed within water, but the two younger fish don't even know that water exists. It is just their condition. It's about the fact that we get sometimes too accustomed to our surroundings, and again, the constraints of the system in which we're operating, to begin to even question whether it's, what is it? What are we actually in? So I say kind of we look, but we don't see, and sometimes we listen, but we don't hear. We're so socialized into the status quo that we have trouble imagining that it could be different. We too often accept what is without considering what could be. But progress is often not linear, and advances often require thinking differently. Realizing that we become inured into a system, it starts by realizing that we've become inured to a system that may no longer be serving its stated purpose. So what could you change if you could? One area that I was working in, I was editor of Circulation, Quality Care and Outcomes for almost a decade. And when I stepped down from that journal editorship position, I started contemplating journals. I mean, people who know me know that I'm kind of always questioning whether our current assumptions are valid and whether we should be doing things the way that we're always doing things. So I guess my transition here should have been, I want to focus on one area, which is related to the medRxiv. So I ended up writing this piece. This was my final piece as an editor when I still had control over, if I wrote something, I could put it in the journal. And this is what I wrote. I wrote the end of journals. And I said, for hundreds of years, medical journals have served as arbiters of the quality of medical research. But the traditional peer-reviewed publication model is fraying. The hierarchical gateway to publication, historically in the hands of experts, is at odds with the ubiquitous democratization of data and information in the 21st century. I was getting to the end of my time there, and I was asking, are the journals really serving the best needs of scientists and the public, society at large? And why do we always yield to the fact that this is the only approach towards medical communication that we should be using, and it's integrated into our promotions and a whole wide range of areas. It's so strongly fit within the structures of academic medicine, for example. And I just started asking myself, is this the really best way? And I said, the impending revolution in the approach to evaluate and disseminate scientific finding is not an indictment of the talent, intentions, or products of editors and viewers, but a response to a model that may simply have run its course given societal and technological change. Of course, you know that the journals, of course, are large enterprises. Many of them are run by billion-dollar corporations. And so, you know, they have a large stake in the perpetuation of that system. But maybe it's time to start questioning some pieces to it. So I wrote in this piece about how publication through peer review is too slow, too expensive, too limited. You know, that the journals are putting it in a position. I'd say the too slow is if we think we're working on projects that have applicability to people's health, then is waiting months to years before it gets published and shared in a peer-reviewed publication. Isn't that a problem? Too expensive. Well, you know, the more successful you are, you'll see as journals now these days, the more you'll have to shell out in publication fees. So you're producing the content that then is being used to generate profits for the journals, but you're also being given author fees to pay. And sometimes it can be quite hefty, and not just for open access, but sometimes just for the privilege of publishing. And in my journal, Circulation, Quality, Care, and Outcomes, we would give people a bill every time we published one of their articles. And then the two limited parts is just around what's within scope. I said they're too unreliable. Who's doing studies on the reliability of peer review within journals? My own experience is that the same paper, essentially the same paper, can get vastly different reviews, even from top journals, and sometimes can land in a very prime position and sometimes can fall down low. And at least to my eye, the quality is not that much different. And I really believe that if I were to submit 10 times to the same journal, that in many cases, decisions would be quite different. I think they're too focused on the wrong metrics. The impact factor is killing us in medicine because it's really about what's going to get clicks and citations rather than what may have enduring importance. And that does drive editorial decisions, I can tell you. And we were getting a lot of pressure in my journal. Every journal gets those pressures. And I know I sit on other editorial boards, I sit on oversight groups, and they're talking about impact factors all the time. Too powerful, try to appeal a paper. Sometimes you can get through, but the truth is most of it's occurring behind a black box of decision-making. Too parochial, too static. I can go on about all these things. Too dependent on flawed business model. And, but this sort of led me to a conclusion that we've arrived at a juncture where medicine and science need new vehicles for dissemination of knowledge. These new approaches will enable us to separate wheat from chaff in order to better serve the public. The question for all of medical publishing and for those who consume medical knowledge is how that would best be accomplished in a new world that's flat, digital, and transparent. And so this is about sort of my thinking at the end of my editorship, thinking like we need to be able to find some new ways of doing things. Now, for a long time, you know, I have a long history of a wide variety of streams of research that interest me. And they're largely around making healthcare more effective and efficient and equitable, timely, patient-centered, safe, trying to help strengthen the information that's available for clinical decision-making and put us in a better position to make choices that are in the best interests of our patients and their preference, considering their preferences and values, and also in the healthcare system writ large and for society. But I've also been involved from the very beginning in thinking about the overall ecosystem of research. It is where we live. It's the village that those of us in academia are part of. And so one of the questions is, what are we doing to contributing to strengthening that ecosystem? What is our responsibility beyond doing peer review for journals or sitting on committees, but to rethink and re-engineer that actual ecosystem so that it better serves needs, both from everything from grants and grant applications. I've written about that, tried to reform it when I was on PCORI, hard to do, lots of inertia, to this issue around publishing, but also around open science, open access, open communication, getting rid of firewalls. These are all things that have been on my mind, at least, and thinking that it's our responsibility as members of this community to try to make a difference. We've tried to take a scientific approach. Things that have bothered me a lot are things like publication bias. We published a paper looking at publication reporting of clinical trial results. This was in 2016. Things have improved a little bit since then, but they still are not good. And we showed that studies that had been registered in clinicaltrials.gov, clinical trials, experiments on human beings, which had been then, there's a field within clinicaltrials.gov where you can then go back and say whether the trial was completed. So people who took the time to register the initial trial and to say it was completed, this is the curve of the percent that they're published in and what time frame. So you can see that at 20 months, you're still only at about 20% published. And then if you start going out to 5 years, the curve starts to flatten out and you're only at about 60% publication. Now you may say, that's crazy. Experiments on human being clinical trials, and 40% of them never see the light of day. And by the way, this included not being posted on clinicaltrials.gov and not being published. There's no public way to find out what the results of that trial was that was done. And we went on to say, like, well, people said, well, some of these are small trials or insignificant trials. So then we went and said, well, what about NIH-funded trials? So let's do the same thing. Joe Ross, a close colleague of mine, a brilliant scientist, and led this effort. We worked with Deb Zarin, who was head of clinicaltrials.gov at that time. And we worked together to try to say, what about the NIH trials? And what we said was the median period of follow-up after the trial completion that we did in this study was 51 months. And at 51 months of the NIH trials that had been conducted, only about 70% were published overall, only 70%. 30% of NIH-funded experiments on human beings had never been shared, either on clinicaltrials.gov or by publication. And by the way, among the published trials, the median time to publication was 23 months. So almost 2 years after the trial was finished, by the time it ended up in the peer review literature. Now, we tend to think about trials in ways that, are like simultaneous, late-breaking trials and simultaneous publication. Those are in our minds, big meetings and the trials are available immediately. But that's not the typical case. The typical case in this study was 23 months. Now, we published this, NIH balked. They thought this was impossible. Couldn't be true. Mike Lauer led a study from the NIH that ultimately was published in New England Journal of Medicine that was a complete validation of these findings. They found almost exactly the same numbers that we found. And at that point, I think recognized that this was a problem. So what I'm talking about is that there's issues of lots of publications never seeing the light of day. No one can ever see what they are. You may say, well, maybe those studies were done poorly. Maybe we shouldn't have seen them. They were experiments on human beings. There are participants in those studies who entered them with the expectation that generalizable scientific knowledge would be shared, even if the trial was not strong. Shouldn't the results be known? The community be able to evaluate them and to make a judgment on them? And then, as I showed you, even when you consider among those published, you're talking 2 years or more for clinical trials, And then there's something else here around collaboration. I'll put this slide up just to say that by not sharing and the delays, it also impedes the ability for people to build on each other's work, to learn from errors. And what I mean by that is I may have designed a trial that I could have done better, but by not sharing it, by not having other people have the ability to view it, to understand it, we can't continue to iterate and get better. There is no perfection usually within science. We're each trying to do the best job we can with resources we have and with the questions we have. And the best way to go forward is by having us all work together. So in the midst of all this, I'm sort of thinking, what would really solve this problem of speed, efficiency, open access, better communication, address publication bias, and not necessarily supersede peer review, although, that end of journals piece was a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Of course, but the points I were raising were serious and issues. If there's going to be continuing peer review as a publication of record, I felt that these are issues that needed to be addressed, but maybe there needed to be something else. And I was starting to be inspired by some of the work that was going on in the preprint space. I'd been invited to be part of ASAP Bio, which grew out of the life sciences, a group, nonprofit group, ultimately run by Jessica Polka and Ron Vale at the far left here, Harold Varmus was part of this. And we were sort of starting to think about how can we improve communication? And in the course of that, I became oriented to what was going on with bioRxiv in the life sciences. I became familiar with Paul Ginsberg, who's up at the top in the middle, physicist who started arXiv, which Cornell runs, which was in the physical sciences and originally within physics. The whole idea of preprints, and I'm going to say this, and I'll define this for you in a minute, but started when people just wanted to pin their papers on their doors of their offices and have their colleagues, as they came by, read them and make comments on them. And Paul went from that into, with technology and with colleagues, was able to push that into different directions. Brian Nosek at the bottom at the Center for Open Science is just a remarkable guy. And these people started hearing this word preprint. I never even been familiar quite with it before. This is maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And then I realized, in economics, whenever I read something from NBER, those were preprints. And in data science, when I was reading things on arXiv, those were peer review preprints. I want to take 1 second just to tell you about Brian Nosek, because I just think this is, he's the most extraordinary guy, psychologist at the University of Virginia, and is pushing forward the frontiers of integrity and innovation within publication science. But I just want to familiarize you with this, just to give you a sense of how creative his mind is. This is like a public service announcement in the middle of my talk, but I wanted to just tell you about this. So Brian hatched this idea with a bunch of colleagues to look at the reproducibility of science. And Brian's deeply committed to transparency and wanted to sort of, I think, wake us up in the field about what's going on. So what they did was a study of 29 teams. They went out and got 29 data science teams with 61 analysts, and they gave them all the same data set to address the same research question: whether soccer referees are more likely to give red cards to dark skin toned players than to light skin toned players. I'm taking this straight from the abstract. And but the most important thing here was, this is a worthy question, but the issue was, if I give a bunch of teams the same data and the same question, what will happen with regard to the results? And what he found was that the analytic approach varied widely across teams, and the estimated effect size ranged from 0.89 to 2.93 in odds ratio units. 20 teams, about 70%, found a statistically significant positive effect, and 9 teams didn't observe any significant relationship. And the 29 different analyses used 21 unique combinations of covariates. Neither the analyst's prior beliefs about the effect of interest, that whether they believe that there would be bias or not, nor their level of expertise explain the variation in outcomes. And peer ratings of the quality of the analyses didn't account for the variability either. So it wasn't that the smartest or the best or the most qualified people were all getting one group of answers and everybody else was getting something else, or that even by the quality, even top quality approaches in different hands were yielding different answers. And they were using different covariates. They were making micro decisions about how to do the analyses. This is a driving piece of, again, about publication bias and about data sharing. And the point is, there isn't just one definitive answer often, but we have to begin to understand a range of approaches and sensitivity analyses and appreciate that the same data with the same question in different hands might yield a different answer. And even if the one you're looking at looks like it's done really well, another really well done paper might yield a different answer. We had this experience in our own group with time to reperfusion and mortality and outcomes. There was a paper that was published in the Journal of Medicine that suggested door to balloon times were not associated with improved mortality. We took the same data set, analyzed, it took actually a year and a half to analyze it in what we thought we pre-specified, gave the approach in what we thought was a rigorous and came up with a very different approach that was published in Lancet. This is just nature science. Science is, as Francis Collins has said, progressive and self-correcting. But along the way, the only way that we do this is through sharing and sharing results, sharing data, and opening up science in ways that we haven't done before. This is, by the way, is just 538 did a figure from this paper that sort of showed you how the point estimates for the 29 teams. And you can see at the far right, there were 2 teams that found really remarkably strong effect, but then the rest of the teams were more modest, and then a bunch of teams found no effect at all. Anyway, I'm just sort of, again, making the case for we've got to be able to think about how our research infrastructure and our ecosystem is continuing to bolster this sort of openness, sharing, and understanding that different groups, expert groups, may sometimes come to different conclusions. So what is this preprint thing, by the way? So let me just give you a definition. It's a research manuscript yet to be certified by peer review and accepted for publication in a journal. It's actually not a peer-reviewed paper. It's a pre-peer reviewed paper. And a preprint server is an online platform dedicated to the distribution of preprints. So this is just a sort of a way to explain it. So this is, in our usual case, researcher drafts a manuscript, submits it to a journal. There may be an initial decision to reject, or if it's not, it will be to bring it through to peer review. Peer review goes, and there's an editorial decision. Finally, that may be a circular thing. I just went through something that went through 6 rounds of tedious revisions. The view of the author versus view of the editor about whether these revisions actually make a difference can diverge. But anyway, you can go through cycles then to production and share with the community. And they up here, it says 3 months to a year. We also, you all who are publishing have this experience. We put a paper into a good journal, reasonable journal. It took them 5 months to send it out for peer review. I still don't understand why that is. They said, well, the first editor had sat with them for a while, and then they transferred it to another editor. I've had papers that were rejected and rejected and rejected, and then they got still into a high quality journal, but now it's like almost 2 or 3 years later. I had a paper that sat in a revision. So it was brought back to us. They said, revise and resubmit, revised and resubmit. 14 months later, they hadn't gotten back to us with a decision despite almost monthly emails to the editors. Again, a high quality journal within a specific field, one that you would recognize and with an impact factor that was, so people would be considering impressive. Finally just pulled it, sent it somewhere else. Within another 3 months, it was published. So this is what our usual thing is. The preprint's about, I've got a paper, I've finished it, I want to share it. I'm going to submit it to the preprint server. Within 1 to 5 days, it's going to be up in open access. Anyone can get to it. It's shared with the community. There can be journal independent review. Anyone, there's people who comment on it, usually on Twitter. The people that commented on the site. People can send you emails. There have been situations where people email you who want to collaborate because they've just noticed something you've done. You improve the journal, you improve the manuscript yourself. You can submit the 2nd version, the 3rd version, the 4th version, the 5th version, whatever you want. When it gets published, if it gets published, and publication is not always the goal. Sometimes the goal is to share some data that will eventually lead to something more, but you want to share a chunk of work. And so you share something, and in this case, when it's published, there's a link to the publication. So on the preprint server at medRxiv, for example, there's a link to that publication. So, there's a lot of preprint servers, by the way. I mean, once I started appreciating this, I started going like, whoa, this is where it was. And again, I'm very heavily into data science these days. I'm into, we're doing a lot of work with advanced data management and informatics and machine learning and AI. And, if you want to stay up on that field, you only do it by staying up with the preprint servers. If you can't be doing it by looking at peer review publications, my colleagues in economics, it's the same thing in all of these fields, that the preprint server goes up, and that's what fosters a lot of internal discussion and helps with collaboration. And then the publication, peer review publication, is down the line, and it becomes the publication of record. This ASAP Bio put this together. This is just sort of some of the studies. It can be for priority claim. Two people could have made the same discovery, the same insight. Should it be that it depends which journal you send it to and how long was the review cycle, or should you just get it up and have it as a priority claim that this is what you've done and dated, stamped, it's archived for anyone to read. Increased citations, proof of productivity. I mean, you can cite these in NIH grants now, in jobs submissions. People can see what you're working on now, today, not just what you were working on 6 months ago, a year ago, but really get that. You can receive feedback. All these things can make a tremendous difference in the speed with which our community can interact and learn from each other. So, I mean, and I will say, like, part of me was, I wanted this for me. I mean, as an investigator, I wanted to be able to share rapidly the work that we were doing when we finished it, so that we could continue to improve it and get the kind of feedback that would help us do better. So all of this was sort of going on, and I just also wanted to say this sort of bias towards action. And, this gets back to my original thing about stone soup or making change, sort of like, so this idea was sort of percolating. I spent time thinking about it. I ended up going back to our group. We'd spent a lot of time on the Yale Open Data Access Project, trying to figure out how we could facilitate data sharing in medicine. And I came to that meeting one day and I said, the next thing we should do a preprint server. We should do a preprint server in clinical medicine. And we should just stand it up. And, the team, and Joe is an important part of the team, but lots of people on that team. They're crazy enough to say, like, yeah, sure, that sounds like a good idea. What do we do? And I said, I don't know. I'm not sure. We need to study this a little bit and figure out how to do this. But this idea of biasing towards action, if you think you have an idea and you think it may be meritorious, then dig in and try to figure out what it takes to do it. There was a peer review Congress coming up. This was the 8th International Congress on Peer Review and Scientific Publication. And it was in September 2017 in Chicago. And every major medical journal sends representatives to this meeting. And it's a science of the publication field. And for some reason, they asked me to give a keynote without a title and without a particular subject. They just said, would you be willing to give a keynote at this meeting? So I went back to the team and I said, I think I should give a keynote. And I think what I'll do is I'm going to announce medRxiv. And I still wasn't sure how we were going to do this, but I said, I think I'm going to just tell all the medical publishers that there's going to be a clinical preprint server, and we're going to do this. And it's not going to be ours. Like, it's not ours, Yale, or ours, mine and Joe's. It was going to be of the community. And we're going to try to do this together, but we're going to announce it and make the case for it. So I gave this talk in front of this room full of people. And by the way, you can see that I spelled it differently than medRxiv. There's a story about how we ended up dropping the A, but anyway, just told them that medical publishing is going to be different, and we're going to have a preprint server, and looking for anyone who wants to do anything with me. Now, at the end of the talk, got lots of comments. Howard Bachner from JAMA and Steve Goodman from Annals, friends of mine, but sharp critics of this idea of preprint servers. Don't we have enough misinformation out there? Isn't peer review necessary before as a filter for medical knowledge and so forth? And I would tell you that we took very seriously all of these comments, and we listened intently. And I think this is another piece of this, which is not to have the hubris to think you know all the answers, even though you think you know where you're going, and to try to incorporate good ideas that might come from different directions, even if they come in terms of criticism. And so this ultimately led to what became medRxiv. We took it turned out a year and a half after that, almost 2 years, to really put together something that we thought would minimize unintended adverse consequences and promote the benefit to the community. And what happened after that talk, and this is the sort of stone soup part of it, was sitting in down, maybe doing email or something in the lounge area outside the meeting. And there were maybe 1,000 people at this meeting. It was a big meeting. And John Inglis from Cold Spring Harbor came up to me and said, we were thinking about something around a preprint server. We've been having such success with bioRxiv and life sciences. We were thinking maybe we should get into this. Next thing we knew, someone from BMJ came up and said, I think we would be interested in it, not as a feeder to BMJ, not as something BMJ would own, not as something that would be affiliated strictly with BMJ, but as a community contribution, we would be willing to help. And the idea was Cold Spring Harbor is a publishing house and an educational group, and is a nonprofit that's well known within the life sciences. BMJ brought sort of gravitas around from the publication world, and we could bring academia. And again, the idea was never that this was going to be ours, but how do we build something that the community might embrace? And we were able to build on top of infrastructure that Cold Spring Harbor had used for bioRxiv. I really don't know how we would have done it on our own. I mean, we were going to work with Brian Nosek. I was disappointed to tell Brian had put together kind of an incubator for preprints, and deep admiration for Brian, but we kind of broke away and said we were going to join the bioRxiv group. And so I think we would have ended up doing something with Brian, but this is what we ended up creating. And many of you may not have ever even heard of it, except that in the pandemic, if you're reading the newspaper, they're often saying, and a preprint just came out, and something on medRxiv. And if it's responsible journalism, they're saying that these are pre-peer review. I will say that I'm not only founder, but I'm an avid user. I just put Krumholz into the medRxiv search, and I got 206 results. Maybe I have to go back and see if all these are accurately pegged, but these are the ones that all showed up on the first page. And I mean, it has been amazing for me because we finish a paper, we post it, we promote it for the purpose of gathering critique, for being avid for people to come in and tell us, what do they think about it? What do they think could be better? Where could we turn differently? And for the notion that science isn't static, it's iterative, and we want to be able to iterate quickly. And I think preprints have become particularly important in the pandemic. We really grew rapidly with pandemic-related content because there's something before preprints. I mean, there's SEC announcements, there are rumors. At scientific meetings, somebody can just throw up a poster and then the poster disappears, or someone gave slides, but they didn't share the slides, can never find the slides. I mean, that's all really pre-peer review. I mean, they get screened rapidly, but it's on a little paragraph. Scientific meetings, you really lose the main gist of it. And so this is a place where even if you're going to a scientific meeting, you can post a preprint, you can refer people to it. It's going to be there. It's not going to go away. And it anchors that. Tweets, by the way, people are tweeting even before preprints are up. Press releases. I mean, a lot of times there's the sprint trial, for example, is one thing I ended up with Eric Topol writing a piece in the New York Times about this, where the results of the sprint trial, remember the intensive blood pressure reduction therapy, was done before publication. There was no preprint. And so people are sort of left scratching their head, like intensive treatment's good, but like we have none of the information about this trial. And that was sort of getting us thinking like this is something that can be intermediate between just announcing it in a press release and actually a publication record. So medRxiv is a community-based, not-for-profit, free to everyone, author-centric services, not products or publications. It's publisher and journal independent. It's BMJ has helped through lots of contributions, but it's not of a particular journal. Elsevier's got a preprint server too, but but it's tucked in with a lot of their journals. medRxiv is just of the community. Rapid posting within usually 24 to 48 hours. And then you can continue to revise. Once it's published, we don't want you adding another version to the preprint. We want you to link to the publication. But up until the publication, you can continue to add as many versions as you want. There are transfer pipelines to and from journals. You put something up as a preprint, you can hit a button and send it to a wide range of journals that have said it can go from preprint to submission seamlessly. There are content APIs, feeds, social media accounts, and text and data mining resources that are associated with medRxiv. So we did have to think about how we're going to mitigate concerns and risks. And so we created submission requirements. This is more than a physics preprint where with really virtually no screening, you can just throw it up. But this is clinical medicine. So we had to think about how to make this safer, submission requirements, clear posting criteria, establish screening process. And we needed to signal a need for caution when scientists, non-scientists read and review the preprint. So we have also responsibility to communicate that this is pre-peer review. So on the site, we have things like preprints or preliminary reports of work that should not have been peer reviewed. They shouldn't be relied on to guide clinical practice or health-related behaviors and should not be reported in news media as established information. We say the article's a preprint, has not been peer reviewed. We say, what does that mean? You can click on that and go for more information, but also that it reports new medical information that is yet to be evaluated and so should not be used to guide clinical practice. Now, for many of you, you can do your own peer review, but we're trying to guard against the public or when a preprint comes out in an area that you're not expert in, that everyone really knows and is keyed into this. And we also are trying to make sure journalists and other individuals report medical research to consider when discussing works that appear in medRxiv and emphasize that it has yet to be evaluated by the medical community and the information presented may be erroneous. So what we do is we follow ICGME guidance. We make sure that people disclose funding and competing interests. Everyone has to have an IRB if they're doing any research on people. And we check this. There has to be ethics committee statement, a study registration when applicable, a study protocol. I was just thinking, I never did like this whole screen. Whether they're going to data share and that they were using reporting guidelines. And so what's happened? I mean, we started off in July of 2019, and we were growing actually faster than bioRxiv at the same time, from the time zero. But then the COVID took off, and we became a really go-to place for people to post content rapidly. Now, people would say to me that, well, but some of the stuff that was posted was, not necessarily going to bear out, and the science wasn't necessarily strong. My point is, that's the point. It's out there for the public to comment on. It is transparent and clear and has to be understood that it's a preprint. And it's up to us to make it normative, that people take that into account. And if you are someone who's an expert who can evaluate it, great. That's good. Then you are that far ahead of the game. But if you're not, you have to understand the state of it. But you can see this cumulative new papers. This goes, I think, almost to June. We're over 20,000 new papers. That a lot of it, CV here, usually for me, CV is cardiovascular, CV here is COVID. So usually the CV is about, you can see the COVID papers are in the light green, and that represents really the majority of the papers. Here's another way to look at this by subject category. Infectious disease was almost a quarter of all the ones that were received, and epidemiology was 20%. Almost all of those, or vast majority of them, were COVID papers. But we're starting to grow in a wide variety of other areas as the rest of medicine's picking up on the value of this. And again, I'm saying if you're working in areas where time matters, then you want to be using a preprint server, I believe. And also, if you're a reader, if you're a clinician, if you're a reader of the medical literature, you want to start being alert to what's showing up in preprint servers, because particularly when they're coming from high quality groups and it's high impact information, you want to be ahead of the game. You want to be able to be tracking certain areas. And so like all the recovery trials that Martin Landry put together with his really great team, all showed up in medRxiv about a month before they were published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And again, would know that that's a preprint, but it's giving you a look forward in terms of what's happening. How about withdrawals? Well, we've had very few manuscripts that had to be withdrawn. We don't really call them retracted. They're preprints because they're not, so they never were peer republished. So we use a different terminology. But at this point, we had 39 of 22,800 medRxiv preprints that were withdrawn. That was about 0.2%. Most of those represent something where there'd been some funny business going on. And also, if you just looked only at the COVID-related preprints, it's about the same thing, about 0.2%. So again, when you're putting something up on a preprint, when the preprint server, no one's vouching for it. But certainly then if there's something that's showing fraud or blatantly wrong, or meaning that there was something flawed in the way in which they approached it, or that on retrospect, there would be something harmful associated with, we haven't really had that situation, then we would withdraw it. Just to show you, I think this one would be better. So if you look just at July alone, we had 6 million abstract views, 700,000 full text views, and 1.7 million PDF downloads. People are going to medRxiv now for information. They're going to really understand where's the science, not to get peer-reviewed publication of record, but to get research in progress. The research is in motion, and to be able to get a sense of what's happening in different places. And for me, this is again, a little bit emblematic of the stone soup. I mean, we started with a big pot and we threw a rock in, and we weren't even really sure how to make the soup. And people joined and became part of it. And it's been remarkable. Overall, 12,100 institutions. So the authors have come from over 12,000 institutions in 145 countries. Top countries, USA, UK, India, Germany, but 145 countries. This is truly a global effort. And it's gratifying to see that many people have found it useful. I just want to acknowledge the team, the other founders, Theo Bloom, John Inglis, Claire Rawlinson, Joe Ross, Richard Seaver, and then of course the very capable team on content, product, technology. But we keep this pretty light. I mean, this is the entire team that's pushing forward, but also the affiliates. And I urge any of you, especially house staff, trainees, you want to become part of medRxiv. We need people to do the initial screening. Again, volunteer work, but you can be part of this community. You can get a chance to see things as they're being submitted, and you can become part of the team. And so if you're interested, send me a note. Love to be able to expand the number of people that we have that are part of this community. And we've always said, this isn't ours. This is our communities, and we should be working on it together. So, and what I'm also hoping is that maybe as a result of this talk, this is ASB by with this, but you'll post preprints, you'll cite preprints, you'll review preprints, and you'll read preprints, and you'll become an astute user of the service. So finishing up, so how's the water? What the hell is the water? I mean, I'm back to kind of thinking about change. This was just within our own ecosystem. But as we know, there are so many worthy areas in medicine or related to medicine where we should be problem solvers. We should be thinking about what actions need to be taken. We need to recognize that when we do solve problems, like, it takes hard work. It takes really diving in. This medRxiv, thousands and thousands of hours to really ultimately make it stand up and work and function well. But it's the gratification is in the solving of the problems in our own world, between equity and effectiveness and efficiency and evidence and the role of the patient within our own entire system. We need to be thinking about, what are we doing in our current systems that really no longer serve the people for whom they were originally designed, or that there was never a design. They just were created bit by bit over time without necessarily truly focusing on who they were going to help. And what are we going to do to redesign them so that they better address and attend to the needs of the people that we seek to serve? So I just end like I begin, which a stimulus to you is, what could you change if you could? And what would it take to start? And who could you get to join you in order to successfully accomplish your goals? Thank you very much.
Dr. Krumholz, thank you very much. That was fantastic. And I personally love the idea of thinking outside the box in these really broad and engaging ways. I'll let you know that your camera turned off when your screens went to presenter view. So if you
Oh my goodness, you
can
didn't see all my expressions and all the...
We saw them for most of the talk, I promise. But I will just go ahead and get started since we still have a few minutes left. And we have a lot of questions from our audience today. I would say the bulk of them revolve around probably those first questions that you got when you presented to the journal editors, which is around safety and data analysis and getting out there good data. There's also a lot of other engaging questions. The first one that comes out is just a practical one, which is, how is this funded? and how secure is the funding in the long term?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So, I mean, I have to ask Chan Zuckerberg about that, but we built it so that the funding is that the servers will be able to be supported for a very long time to be able to maintain the preprints that are already posted. And then the question is kind of going forward. Again, we're very lean operation. None of us take salaries. The money goes into infrastructure. Cold Spring Harbor, they take salaries. They need to be supported. But I always believe that if you create something of value, then in the end, people won't want to let it go away, and that we'll have to figure out how this best works. All the preprint servers have sort of different models of support. A lot of them been able to find foundation support. Cornell actually runs arXiv itself, but yeah, I mean, if I knew that I would only start something if I knew that I had an endowment and perpetual funding, there'd be a lot of things that I couldn't start. I think this idea was drive the value, see whether or not the community will embrace it, see whether or not it produces something that people want and find useful. And then even when we started, we didn't know that CZI would come in, but we sort of thought that if we had something that was amazing, then we'd find somebody who wanted to support it.
Makes sense. That's great. You mentioned an interesting thought, which is that it's one thing to pre-publish physics data or to post it on your door, because if you're a little bit off, you're a little bit off and somebody can improve upon your work. But a lot of this preclinical data, it may enter the world faster than some scientists would like. There's as we know, a great drive to get preclinical data into the clinical sphere. And I think we all have lessons from our careers where something that we thought was going to work either didn't work or was actually harmful in the end. How do you balance that speed and accuracy equation?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of having people understand what science is. That it is, like I said, progressive and self-correcting. As clinicians, we need to understand the strength of the evidence when we're contemplating and contemplating the literature and guiding our patients in the choices that they need to make, or in situations where they're unable to make decisions that we're helping to make them with their families or even on our own if they can't participate. But I don't think the answer is to do the system that we've had where it can take years to get things out, and the cycle times just are too slow for real progress to occur. It needs to be iterative. In medRxiv, what we said at the very beginning was, and we have a weekly meeting. I wouldn't really call it an editorial meeting because we're not evaluating the quality of the studies, but we're asking affiliates as they do the screening to pick out papers that they have any concerns about that if it turns out not to be true, it could cause harm. Now, there's a wide range of opinions about that, but we're often discussing, and it could be that a side effect of the vaccine, or it could be a wide range of issues, and sometimes we look and we say, that really needs to go to the CDC next, or, this would be such a big change in what we do. It's better off through peer review before it gets highly disseminated through a preprint server. And by the way, I don't know, not all the preprint servers, you can preprint somewhere probably without that level of screening, but that's what we do. But I'm just firmly of the mind that we need to get things out and people need to understand what pre-peer review means. And we need to be able to debate openly what much of this means. But yeah, I mean, what happens when someone wants to post something that says ivermectin, does this or that? And I think we've said we don't want to accept things just because it confirms our biases, but the question is whether or not it will put anyone at risk. And whether or not once these things come up, people can say no single study necessarily should change practice unless it's, the dexamethasone study was one that could, but most of them can't. And they need to be seen in the totality of the evidence. And it's up to us to both convey that to the public and help people understand that. But I will say so far, I have yet to see a situation where there has been harm caused by it. But, we're always vigilant in trying to be careful about it.
Yeah, and I think a related question to that is another good one from the audience, which is, it's one thing if a doctor sort of takes this information and uses it with other physicians or to explain to their patients, but this stuff obviously is open to anybody with an internet connection. It's probably very easy for it to hit the news. And there we lose a little bit of control of the information. Have you seen that effect happen yet where something has hit the news before maybe you or the preprint servers would have wanted it to?
Actually not, because the thing I like about the preprint is that there's actually a document that people can look at and see what it's based on. So, when somebody stands up in front of everyone and says you should inject bleach or you should do, a wide variety of things. I mean, remember, you've got social media, Twitter, you've got, there's a lot of sources of information for people that is pushing out various amounts of information. You don't even know where it's coming from or what it's based on. The preprint server at least has a document that's archived that anyone can access. Somebody says this proves X, the next person can see, I can see exactly what you were basing that on. And, if they want to debate it back. I think on the public side, the public's just getting pelted on all different sides by all different kinds of views. And the best thing that we can do is, like I said, let's put out what it's based on. Let's see what people are talking about, rather than there was a study, it's yet to be published, but it's shown X, Y, or Z. That thing ends up getting legs and lots of rumors and getting people, pushing it. At least this is a situation where people can say, your doctor, any doctor can look. What is that based on? A preprint? I'll take a look. Or let me see what other people are saying about this. But it was 10 people. Maybe that's not really enough to make a conclusion on.
It makes sense. So a couple of questions about academic credit here, because I think we still get, sort of quote unquote full credit for the published articles. Any worry about people getting scooped by putting preprints out there that then are printed more formally elsewhere by other research teams?
Yeah, I think it's the anti-scooping, because you're getting it up within days of finishing it, and you're establishing the provenance of the idea and of the work. And so if you end up getting unlucky because you have to go through 3 journals and 3 cycles of peer review, and it's 18 months later that comes up and somebody else happened to put it into a journal that turned it around quickly and got it up faster, I mean, why should that be the barometer of, and of course, I'm always pushing to say, like, science should be a team sport now. And the truth is, it's really hard for it to be one person who had one idea. But I do think that it's good to put, stake in the ground and say, this is what I think. If you got new ideas, you got novel ideas, you got novel results, then there will be no question as to when that was first shared. And if it ends up getting peer reviewed, the provenance will go back to the original claim and the original sharing of it on the preprint server. So I think it's actually, it helps with that, and it establishes it versus somebody heard it at an RIP or at a national meeting, but it was never even anchored anywhere. Someone sort of says they remember what the person said. Here, you're actually anchoring the idea and the data and trying to make essentially the claim of that.
That's great. And I think we have time for one other question if you have another minute yourself.
Sure.
And this comes from some of the trainees who are also in this boat of needing to publish. For PhDs, it's a requirement often to get their PhD. For our residents, it can be a near requirement to get into a competitive fellowship program. How does medRxiv affect graduate students? How does it affect their ability to publish? Does this make it easier for them? How do they get credit for this kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a boon to them. And, you can see this all the time. I mean, job talks in economics are all based on preprints, that because in economics, it can take a couple of years finally for it to wind its way through the publication process. We've heard many stories, and bioRxiv has more history in this than we do, where, preprints and connected people and helped on jobs. It shows productivity. If you've got papers and you're saying sort of not even impressed, but they're submitted, but like nobody, can actually find them on the web, it's hard to find. You can put up, I guess, your own website, but this is like, you're archiving the information. You can be using it in grant applications. To me, it's a demonstration of what you were doing up until yesterday with regard to what you finished and what you're willing to share. And by the way, it can be chunked. I mean, the nice thing about the preprint server, it's not like, okay, I've got this study, it's got 5 parts. Then you can continue to iterate. I want to share what we just finished, the first part, the second part, third part. You can version it till you're ready to submit it for publication. And I find that to be extraordinarily worthwhile. Again, shortening cycle times of scientific communication and enabling people to be in a position where that others can view their work at any time and appreciate what they've been doing.
That's great. Sadly, we have a number of other questions, but I think we are out of time. So Dr. Krumholz, I really want to thank you for kicking off our medical grand rounds this year, for being such a great friend to the University of Colorado. I know you have a lot of colleagues here, and hopefully if we ever get to do this again, we will absolutely certainly bring you out in person.
Yeah, and send me the questions. I'll be glad to get some answers and send them back to you, and you can distribute them.
I'll do that. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you all.